Welcome everyone to, today's Stanford-Princeton International Relations Lecture Series, and on this Saturday afternoon. So my name is Peiting Sarah Cho, or you can call me Sarah. I'm representing the Princeton Asian Alumni Group, A4P, and I'm the founding chair of A4P Taiwan, and also the global set of vice chair right now. And I'm here to carry the torch from Julie Xie, and she's the chair of the club, Stanford Club of Taiwan, but she's not here at this moment. She's in the States right now, and she's also the owner of this gallery. So actually, we did the talk first time in 2020, and by Emeritus Professor Harry Harding, and at the same site. And Professor Harry Harding is both Princeton alumnus and Stanford alumnus. So, yeah, this lecture series is continued energy. From Emeritus Professor Harry Harding, and we are very honored to have him here today as well. And let me introduce Professor Harry Harding a little bit. He's the former dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and the founding dean of the School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. And he's the Yushan Scholar and Emeritus Professor at the University of Virginia and National Chengchi University. And let's welcome Harry Harding. And we also have another invited guest. It's Professor Shirley Lin, and from University of Virginia, and she is the founding chair of the Center for Asian Pacific Resilience and Innovation, and she's also the non-resident research fellow at Brookings Institution. Let's welcome Professor Shirley Lin. And we also have the other one, an invited guest, and it's Stephen Tan. He's the former president of the Cross-Strait Policy Association, and he's a DC registered lawyer and the former partner at Baking McKinsey in Asian Pacific. And let's welcome Stephen Tan. We have AIT director, former Bill Stanter, but maybe he's not arriving yet. So now I'm going to introduce today's critical person, Dr. Kharis Templeman. And Kharis Templeman is a lecturer at the Center for East Asian Studies at Stanford University and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he is the program manager of the project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region. His area of expertise include democratic transition and consolidation, comparative parties and elections, East Asian security, and the politics of Taiwan. And today he's going to talk about this topic, and it came up from Kharis, so it's can peace be preserved across the Taiwan Strait? Let's welcome Dr. Kharis Templeman.
All right, can you all hear me if I speak like this? Is this good? Okay, great. Thank you in the back. I'm Kharis Templeman. I am the program manager of the project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region at the Hoover Institution, as Sarah noted. Many of you have probably seen, I hope, some of our events over the last couple of years. We're now in a position since COVID where we broadcast all of these publicly. And so I invite you to be added to our mailing list, and you'll be aware of all of the events we're hosting these days. Just to give you one example, we had Ambassador Xiaobi Kim at Stanford in January, and she was willing to do a public event with students and faculty and staff, and we had her in the room for an hour and a half, and she just fielded questions. She had about 10 minutes of comments, and then the students got to stand up and just fire questions at her, and she was completely unfazed. It was one of the most impressive performances I've ever seen in that sort of role. So if you're a fan of Xiaobi Kim, I encourage you to check that video out on our website. Let me also, before I jump in, mention a couple other things that I do at Stanford. One is I teach a regular course on Taiwan politics. It's called Taiwan's Democratic Evolution, and it's offered through the East Asian Studies Department at Stanford. It's finals week. As soon as this talk is done, I have to go home and grade papers and submit final grades. And it's gotten harder to do that because the number of students keeps going up. We're now at 18 students this quarter, which is the highest number I've ever had in that class. They're a really rich, diverse group of students, masters, undergrad, foreign, domestic. Have a couple students, one who's an Army foreign area officer who is actually coming to Taiwan in the summer and will be posted at AIT. Have another who's a mid-career diplomat in the Japanese Foreign Ministry who had to miss the first 2 weeks of class because he was helping with Prime Minister Kishida's visit to the US. And so I allowed it. That was an excuse. That was a viable excuse. Just a really great chance to kind of teach students about Taiwan, and the interest really is surging these days on campus. And then the final thing I'll just flag for you is Stanford does have lots of internship programs for the summer, and interest in those in Taiwan has grown a lot too. So we're going to send at least 5 students to Taiwan this summer through those various internship programs. And I've been involved in helping select those interns over the past few weeks as well. Happy to talk more about our project at the Hoover Institution and my teaching or Taiwan activities on campus in the Q&A or afterwards, one-on-one. But today, the reason I think you're all here is I've been asked to talk about cross-strait relations, the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, and Taiwan's place in the kind of rising U.S.-China confrontation. And so the title of my talk today is Can Peace Be Preserved Across the Taiwan Strait? And I wanted to start by noting an article that appeared a few weeks ago in the Financial Times. This is from a leaked memo an Air Force general said to his own internal staff, "My gut tells me we're going to fight China in 2025. And then this got leaked. It's a headline. There's a lot of controversy about that then, and it gets reported in the Taiwan media, and it adds to kind of nervousness here that maybe we are headed for a hot conflict across the Taiwan Strait sooner rather than later. This is one of the more recent examples of a whole genre of articles now making this same case, that we are headed for a conflict across the strait unless there are some significant changes in the near future. So The Economist last year, as many of you know, called Taiwan the most dangerous place on earth. I don't feel like I'm in a lot of danger right now. I don't know about you. I can think of many more dangerous places to be at this moment on the planet. Taiwan feels pretty safe to me, but that was a kind of marketing ploy, and it's also kind of raised concerns in Taiwan, raised nervousness here. So a whole genre of stuff on this, in making this same case that Taiwan is vulnerable, the vulnerability is rising, China wants to come for Taiwan sooner rather than later. If you're just casually browsing through the headlines here, you might think war is inevitable across the Taiwan Strait, or it's likely. And my answer is no, I don't think it's actually likely, or particularly, it's not inevitable and it's not particularly likely. But I do think what we're in is a bit of a security dilemma between the US and China, and we're misperceiving each other's intentions over Taiwan. I would date this security dilemma really to 2016 and the election of Tsai Ing-wen. Her inauguration speech, in my view, was quite conciliatory. Beijing gave her nothing in response, cut off ties, and started to pressure her government. And then the US side responded to that pressure by becoming increasingly worried that the military activities around Taiwan were kind of laying the foundation for an invasion or some other kind of military coercion. The other thing that I think is going on right now is that there is increasing uncertainty both about China's future trajectory over the next few years and about the US future trajectory. So in both cases, there's greater uncertainty than there has been in at least 30 years, and I would say since the Tiananmen massacre of 1989. Since then, this is an unprecedented moment. All right. So what I'm going to talk about today in today's talk, I have four big items, four things I want to cover. First, I'm going to cover a little bit why the U.S. is relevant to cross-strait issues and cross-strait relations. So I'll give you a little bit of background and history and a sense of why I think the U.S. Has good reasons to defend Taiwan in the event of a conflict, and in fact why I think the U.S. probably would be compelled to come to Taiwan's assistance if there is an attempted forcible annexation. The second is to talk a little bit about relations in the Xi Jinping era. So Xi took formal power in 2012. We've had now 10, 11 years roughly of Xi Jinping. A lot has changed over that time period, and so I'm going to talk about how those changes have generally led to a more worrisome situation across the strait. Third, and probably the most relevant for this audience, where I'm coming from, there's a lot of kind of raging debates about the China threat to Taiwan, the China threat to the United States, and I want to kind of lay those debates out so you get a sense of who's on what side and what are the questions that are really unresolved. There's not a consensus on most of these points in the United States right now. And then finally, I'm an optimist by nature. It's a character flaw of mine. And so I'm going to make the case, I'm basically going to do a bit of a pep talk here. I'm going to make the case that, in fact, it is possible to preserve peace across the strait. In fact, it's more likely than not that we make it through this period without any major conflict. And I think we should have confidence that if both the United States and Taiwan do the right thing, if we can make the appropriate adjustments, we'll be in a better place in 10 or 15 years than we are even today. All right, so first off, U.S. interests in Taiwan. How did Taiwan become a U.S. interest? Taiwan had no connection to the United States before, certainly before 1945, really 1950. But then, as everybody in this room I'm sure knows, the nationalists lost the Civil War to the communists on the mainland. The nationalists fled across the strait, set up a regime in exile, and so Chiang Kai-shek rebuilt the ROC regime on Taiwan. Basically announced that the regime's new capital, temporary capital, would be in Taipei in December of 1949. Right? In January of 1950, the Truman administration made very clear that they were not going to get involved in what they viewed as the last remnants of the Chinese Civil War. And so Taiwan was part of China in Truman's view. It was the last vestige of a failed regime. The U.S. declared that we would no longer subsidize or provide aid to the nationalists and that we would leave them to their fate. And so there's a specific statement from January 5th, 1950, where Truman says, the U.S. will not pursue a course which will lead to involvement in the civil conflict in China. So, number one, the U.S. is done. We're not involved in this conflict. And number two, the second paragraph says, let's see, where is it? Actually, it's in the first line here. The U.S. has no predatory designs on Formosa or any other Chinese territory. So Formosa is part of China in this statement. It's an implication. So what changed between January of 1950 and now? Well, most of you know, North Korea invaded South Korea in June 1950, and suddenly Taiwan's strategic position in what was a budding confrontation with communism around the world from the US perspective made it too valuable, too important to leave to its fate. And so 2 days later, 2 days after the start of the Korean War, Truman comes out and issues another statement that changes the US position on Taiwan. So he, in particular, orders the 7th Fleet in to prevent any attack on Formosa. He places Taiwan in this larger perimeter of US partners and allies in the Western Pacific, and he frames free China on the island of Taiwan as an important piece of the US's resistance to the expansion of communism in the world. And so Taiwan goes from being, kind of a throwaway piece of the Chinese Civil War to now this critical, unsinkable aircraft carrier off the coast of mainland China. And the US has been here ever since. The US has been involved in Taiwan securities for the last 73 years. All right, so what have the US objectives in the relationship been? First and foremost, and the reason the US initially got involved, was to preserve peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and more broadly in the region. Notably, that Truman statement included both deterring a PRC invasion across the strait against Taiwan, but also preventing the ROC from trying to 反攻大陆, right, to retake the mainland. And so the US position was that neither of those were desirable. Any kind of military action by either side was inimical to US interests. And in fact, we had 2 Taiwan Strait crises over these offshore islands. The US position was generally that it didn't want to be dragged into this fight, and it was better if the 2 sides would stop shooting at each other. The second, the US has had a long-standing interest in maintaining a good environment for regional trade and economic growth. And so Taiwan's transformation from a poor, mostly agricultural place in the 1950s into Taipei today, this sparkling metropolis with high GDP per capita, the world's probably single most strategically important company in TSMC. It's a major supplier of semiconductor chips and many, many other things. That's all, from a US perspective, Taiwan is a nice poster child for what it means to be a good partner of the US. You get rich, you turn into a liberal democracy, you're prosperous, and you're free. The third is the US wanted to ensure a friendly, non-communist, and later, once Taiwan democratized, a liberal democracy on the island of Taiwan. And then finally, and this point sometimes gets overlooked in conversations about US interests, but the US interest in Taiwan has never just been about Taiwan. It's also crucially been about the influence Taiwan might have on the PRC's development, right? And so the US, part of the reason the United States is has a stake in Taiwan's status as a liberal democracy and its success and consolidation of that democracy is that it exists as a counterpoint to the CCP's one-party rule on mainland China. And so Taiwan is an existence proof that you can have a Chinese-speaking society and still have a prosperous place with liberal democracy. It's not chaos all over the place when you have democracy and Chinese heritage, right? So if you get nothing else out of this talk today, this is probably the single most important slide in what I'm going to say. Why would the US come to Taiwan's defense? I think there are 4 reasons, and I'm going to go through them in the order in which they have appeared in US policy. So the first is the reason Truman initially sent the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait in 1950. And that is Taiwan's strategic location. So you can see its position in the middle of the first island chain, very close to the PRC. It's actually critical to the defense of Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, which are all important defense treaty allies of the United States. And so if you look at kind of the US worldview, or the view of the region in the 1950s, here's Taiwan. It's this little island, this vulnerable place right off the shore of this massive sea of red on Asia. And so from the US perspective, Taiwan's strategic location matters a lot. Second is what I mentioned earlier, Taiwan's existence as a counterpoint to the PRC. So in the 1950s and 60s, the US advisors actually pressed the nationalist regime to move away from state dominance of the economy, promote export-oriented industrialization, and they did that in part for ideological reasons. They wanted to see Taiwan develop and demonstrate that having a market economy was actually preferable to having a planned economy across the strait. More recently, since Taiwan is now a democracy, the US promotes Taiwan's democratic system as a preferable alternative to the PRC across the strait. Third, and more recently, Taiwan has increasingly become a signal of the U.S. commitment to other partners and allies in the region. So although the U.S. does not have a formal commitment to defend Taiwan, it does have that formal commitment to defend Japan, to defend the Philippines, and defend South Korea. And all of those countries face varying degrees of a territorial threat from the PRC. And so if the U.S. were simply to walk away from Taiwan, it would pretty badly undercut the credibility of that commitment to the other partners and allies in the region. And then finally, and this has gotten a lot of attention over the last 5 years. 5 years ago, I have to confess, I didn't know what TSMC was. I'd never heard of it, all right? And I specialize in Taiwan politics, right? So if I don't know what it is, the average American has no idea. Now, almost every American knows what TSMC is, and they probably want TSMC to build a fab in their state, too. So Taiwan has really emerged as this economic powerhouse and a critical trade partner of the United States. And so the U.S. has a compelling interest, I think, to ensure that we continue to have good trade relations, and the U.S. has access to Taiwan's manufacturing capabilities. So those are the 4 reasons why I think the U.S. Would probably be compelled to come defend Taiwan. So Xi Jinping era began in 2012. What has changed? Why are people increasingly nervous now, whereas they weren't when Xi Jinping came into power in 2012? Well, the first and most obvious is the changing cross-strait balance of power. So the PRC has grown at an average rate of roughly 8% a year from 1978 until 2018, over 40 years. And I could quote other statistics and throw them at you, but I think visually, best demonstration of this growth is the Pudong area of Shanghai, right? In 1990, it was a series of rice paddies and muddy banks on the Huangpu River. And over 30 years, it's turned into now a skyline that looks like downtown Manhattan, right? So rapid growth over these last 30 years. That has enabled a pretty dramatic and sustained expansion of the PRC's military capabilities. So as China's economy has grown by about 8% a year, the PRC's military spending has also grown. It's kept pace with economic growth over the last 30 years, and that is now finally bearing fruit. And so the PRC's modernization has now produced vastly superior capabilities in the military domain to what they had, say, during the third Taiwan Strait crisis in 1996. And then finally, not finally, but next, Taiwan's military spending itself has been pretty flat. And so let me show you some figures on this, just briefly. Here are the annual defense budgets of 5 countries in Asia. We've got Taiwan, the blue line, the PRC, the red line, and then Korea, Japan, and Singapore. The picture that makes US planners really nervous is this, right? So as late as 1996, during the third Taiwan Strait crisis, Taiwan was spending roughly half of what the PRC was spending on its defense. So Taiwan was not in any way, shape, or form outgunned in this conflict. It had a vastly superior military. It had a huge qualitative advantage, even if the PRC's military was larger. Today, that's no longer true, and it probably never will be true again. The PRC has vastly outstripped what Taiwan is capable of fielding. This is the slide that gets some American planners kind of riled up. This is Taiwan's spending in comparison to Korea and to Singapore, 2 peer countries in the region. And you'll see that even as compared to these 2 countries, it's not really fair to compare Taiwan just to the PRC, but even compared to Korea, Taiwan's spending has really lagged over the last few years. And so whereas in 1988, it spent roughly 2/3 of what Korea spent on its military, by 2018, it was spending less than 1/3. All right, and then finally, another way to look at this is spending as a share of the total economy. And so you'll note the PRC here doesn't look out of line. It's consistently spent about 2% of total GDP on the military for the last 25 years. And so it's the PRC's rapid economic growth, not a shifting of resources towards the military away from other things, that has enabled their rapid modern military modernization. Okay, so Taiwan's military has been flat while the PRC's has grown. The bottom line to all of that is that Taiwan no longer has a qualitative military advantage. Taiwan is sending up fighter jets to interdict PRC incursions into Taiwan's ADIZ, and it's, you know, there's a kind of wear and tear on the Taiwan Air Force when they do that, similar set of challenges in the sea domain, and those are really possibly going to take a toll on the Taiwan military's ability to maintain a robust defense. All right. With all of that background out of the way, let me talk a little bit now about what the current U.S. debates are over the question of whether peace can be preserved in the Taiwan Strait. And there are, I should say, strong voices on both sides of each of the issues I'm about to show you. From the U.S. perspective first, there are some ominous trends in this relationship that are really making a lot of observers nervous that Xi Jinping might have an incentive to move on Taiwan sooner rather than later. The first is a lot of Western observers look at Taiwan public opinion and say support for unification is declining, support for the KMT, who's the CCP's preferred bargaining partner in the relationship. The KMT has been struggling over the last few years. These signs should make Xi Jinping concerned that Taiwan is being lost forever, and he may choose then to use military force to prevent or reverse these trends and annex Taiwan. So the first of three charts I'm going to show you from the Election Studies Center where at Zhengda, where Harry is. How many of you have seen this figure before? Let me see. Yeah, just a handful. Okay, so let me say a little bit about what these polling data are drawn from. So starting in 1992, the Election Studies Center, Xuanyan Zhongxin at Zhengda, actually asked a question of a representative sample of Taiwanese adults, and they asked, what do you consider to be your national identity? So do you consider yourself to be Taiwanese, Chinese, or both? And they've asked this question consistently for the last, now we're at 30 years of this question. So we have a nice long time series. And what you can see is Taiwanese is the green line here. It's going up. Chinese, the blue line, has dropped. And so there are very few people who identify solely as Chinese today. And then both is kind of in the middle, but it's quite a bit below Taiwanese now. And so a casual observer will see a rising trend in Taiwanese-only identity and say, wow, the Taiwanese really don't consider themselves to be Chinese anymore. That then implies greater support for independence. And in fact, we're headed for a confrontation across the strait. The second question that Zhengda has asked over the last 30 years is the Tongdu Wenti. So do you support independence or unification or something in the middle? Dark green here is independence immediately. Light green or as soon as possible. Light green is support the status quo now, but move towards independence at some point in the future. Red, not surprisingly, is unification as soon as possible. The dark red is unification at some point in the future, but support the status quo now. And then the other lines are various forms of support the status quo indefinitely, or choose at a later date. And so what you see here is a big jump in support for moving towards independence at some point in the future. And that jump corresponds to the Hong Kong protests in 2019. So there was a real effect of those protests, I think, on Taiwanese public opinion and support for independence versus unification. So that suggests that the Taiwanese are never going to accept a unification model under one country, two systems. That's the same model that Hong Kong came into the PRC under. The Taiwanese people can see what happened in Hong Kong. Completely non-credible commitment from the PRC to preserve Taiwan's way of life. No Taiwanese, there are very few are going to accept that as a deal. The third trend here, to complete the trifecta, is a question about your partisan identification. So they ask, which party do you feel close to, or which party do you lean towards in elections? And traditionally, the blue line here, the KMT, has significantly outperformed the DPP on this measure. And so there's been a significantly larger share of the electorate that identifies with the KMT than the DPP. But in recent years, the KMT's number of partisans in the electorate has fallen pretty dramatically. And the DPP, although it hasn't surged up, is now significantly ahead of the KMT in terms of number of partisans. And so this trend too, if you are sitting in Beijing thinking, trends in Taiwan, are they in our favor or against us? This is another data point that suggests they're against us. The Taiwan people are less and less enamored with the KMT, with the idea of someone who's going to, make nice with Beijing, find ways to cooperate, negotiate with Beijing. And in fact, there's much larger identification with the DPP, which has traditionally been the China skeptical party in the electorate, right? So Taiwan public opinions suggests potentially some ominous trends for Beijing. Second, I've discussed military modernization a little bit. Many of the headline numbers China set to invade by 2027 or whenever are really driven by an expression of intent in terms of capabilities. So the PRC wants to have the capability to invade Taiwan by 2027, according to some US analysts. But, and I should clarify for a lot of people who claim this, that having the capability to invade is not the same as having set a deadline to invade or an open intent to invade. And so this point kind of gets elided in discussions of a deadline for invasion. The best evidence I've seen is that there's no internal deadline by which Taiwan must be unified with the PRC or they will start a conflict over Taiwan. Third, another thing that makes people nervous is changes within the CCP itself. So Xi Jinping just got a third term. He's effectively chairman for life. He has ended term limits for himself. He's also reasserted CCP control over an increasing share of society, of academia, and of the private sector in China. And so the kinds of gradual changes in Taiwan society and economy in the Hu Jintao era, you could squint and at least say they're moving in kind of a market-oriented direction. They're moving perhaps to increase internal party competition, to liberalize space for people to complain or to raise issues. All of those Hu Jintao era reforms have been rolled back. And the CCP is now as dominant in political and economic life as it has been in decades. And then there's a question about the US. As an American, I can criticize my own country here a little bit. We had a bad financial crisis in 2008. There's pretty good evidence that that really affected thinking in Beijing about the US's staying power as the global hegemon. And there's stories about CCP counterparts in conversation with their American interlocutors saying, you had this terrible banking crisis. How dare you lecture us on how to run our economy now? You just had a 10% drop in GDP last year. So we don't have a whole lot to learn from you. And in fact, our state-controlled banking system is probably a lot more reliable, a lot stabler than your system. Likewise, the U.S. Invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and our long-term presence there has been a real drain on U.S. force readiness. And it's led to a decline in American support for military intervention abroad. And so those raise some questions about the U.S. commitment to longstanding partners and allies in the region as well. And then, let's be frank, there's some serious domestic political polarization in the United States between the two parties. Particularly with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, that polarization hit a new high. There's still an open question about whether the two parties can agree on anything involving national security. So all of these trends are a little bit unsettling if what you're worried about is the PRC having an incentive potentially to move on Taiwan in the next few years. So let me talk more specifically about some open questions in the debate about whether Xi Jinping will give the order to move on Taiwan soon. The first is a question about timelines and windows of opportunity. So put simply, is time on the side of the US or the side of the PRC? So if you think the US is going to continue, we'll get over our domestic polarization, our economy will recover and continue to grow at a pretty productive rate, and the PRC is facing some headwinds, then you would believe Taiwan is on the side of the US, we just need to buy time, and eventually China will peak, the US will continue to go up. We'll be in a much better place in 10 or 20 years in the relationship than we are now, because the power imbalance will favor the US to a greater degree than it does today. The alternative argument is that the US, and the PRC makes this argument all the time, the US has hit a period of stagnation and potential decline. China's rise is inexorable. It's the Chinese century, China great, US not so great. And so in 10 or 20 years, China will be in a better position relative to today, and the US will not. And so time is on China's side. And then there's a third argument that says the Chinese are going to realize they've peaked, they're about to go down, and they have a narrow window of opportunity because the US is going to get our act together, we're going to continue to grow, China is stalling out and going to fall, and they better move on Taiwan now or that window is going to slam shut in the future. And so that argument has been made by several people, but most prominently by these two gentlemen, Hal Brands and Michael Beckley, in this rather scary-looking book, The Danger Zone, that says the coming conflict with China. And they make the case that China and generally rising powers in the interstate system, when they peak, that is actually the most dangerous moment in international relations, that they become much more aggressive and desperate in the interstate system than they do if they believe they're going to continue to rise. And the logic here is pretty straightforward. If you think if present trends continue, you'll be in a better place in 10 or 20 years than now, don't take risks, don't screw it up, just lie low, bide your time, and things will happen, just unfold naturally. But if you think things are really going to be bad in 20 years, you have an incentive to try to shake it up, to change the trend somehow. And so their prediction is that, number one, China is close to peak China. China is at about the peak of its power relative to the United States. It's going to start on the downward slope soon, and that's a really dangerous moment where they're going to have to lash out and try to take Taiwan before the US and Taiwan and other partners and allies can be fully prepared to prevent it. Right. Second argument is about deterrence. What deters? So say you're at an elementary school, you're the big kid on the block, you've got some candy, one of your other kids, your friends wants a piece of that candy, and you say, I'm going to leave that there, but if you take that piece of candy, I'm going to smack you across the face, right? That's a form of a threat that results in deterrence, right? I'm threatening you, I'm going to beat you if you take the piece of candy. And so the little kid says, no, I'm not going to take the candy, right? So that's deterrence that works. You've deterred the kid taking the candy. There's another argument that says the only way to deter that kid from taking the candy is actually to grab it and physically put it in your pocket and prevent that kid even from getting close to the candy, right? So it's physically impossible for the kid to take your candy. That's what Elbridge Colby calls deterrence by denial. So you literally have the forces that make it impossible, in this analogy, Taiwan is the piece of candy, literally make it impossible for the PLA to conquer Taiwan. And so Elbridge Colby is probably the strongest voice on this, but there are other people who are making versions of this argument right now that it's all about military balance. And if the US and Taiwan together can improve Taiwan's defenses and US capabilities, we can ensure that the PLA still physically cannot take Taiwan, even if they wanted to, and even if they were willing to pay a very large price to take Taiwan. There's another side of this debate which says absolutely not, actually. China is not willing to pay that high a cost to take Taiwan, or it cares about a lot of other things. And in fact, you can deter China by threatening to cut them off economically, or by threatening to build a much more robust coalition of partners and allies that challenge China if they go after Taiwan. And so you can still maintain deterrence even if the military balance across the strait is really lopsided. And then there's a corollary to this question, which is, if we go back to my analogy of the playground, and I'm the big bully on the block, and I say, don't take that piece of candy, and he says, okay, I won't, and then I go up and smack him anyway, what's his incentive not to take the candy? He's going to get hit either way, so you might as well get a piece of candy out of it, right? So there's a corollary to threats that requires promising or reassuring credibility, a credible reassurance that you won't follow through on the threat if they don't do the thing you don't want them to do. So don't take the candy, I won't hit you, right? That piece is important in this deterrence calculation, and it gets lost a lot these days in conversations about deterrence in Washington. So the US actually, I think, needs to find a way to reassure Beijing, if you don't take Taiwan, we won't support independence. That's been our long-standing position. Our own opposition to Taiwan independence, or at least our own lack of support for Taiwan independence, has been long-standing policy and part of what, in this view, has kept the peace across the strait. The more we move towards saying the Taiwanese people can choose their own future, and if that means independence, great, we support that, the more we're hollowing out our reassurance to Beijing. And likewise, on Beijing's side, the more they say, you know, we're going to use whatever means to take Taiwan, whether it's with force or peacefully, ideally, but we will use force if necessary, that makes the US side nervous. And so if it looks like they're coming for Taiwan no matter what, then why should we avoid supporting independence no matter what? And so there's a reassurance problem on both sides as well. The third debate is, can Taiwan even be defended today? So there's, PRC is very close, the US is very far away, right? And in military terms, that means the PRC has a big advantage, all else equal, over the US in this relationship. And so on the one side, there's a school of thought. Hugh White is an Australian who's made this argument repeatedly, writes a new article basically rehashing the same argument, seems like every year or two, saying, no, Taiwan cannot be defended, it's impossible, Taiwan and the US should just cut a deal with the CCP, get the best deal on unification you can, and the US should just walk away, because otherwise the US is bound to lose a war with China over Taiwan. There are a lot of other voices, and I would say the majority still think a defense is possible. Even if the PRC brings everything they have in a conflict, Taiwan, working with the United States and allies and partners, can actually fend off an attack. There's still an open question about how strong a capability the PLA has today, how strong a capability will they have in 5 years, will they have the things like amphibious landing craft that are necessary to move lots of troops across the strait. Right now, there's a lot of questions about whether the PLA would be able to achieve an amphibious landing successfully, despite everything that's happened in their modernization so far. And then next is the PRC's own Taiwan policy. And there's an open question about whether Xi Jinping himself has switched from deterring independence, which has been the long-standing kind of chief goal of PRC policy towards Taiwan, to compelling unification. So if we don't get unification by a certain date, we send in the troops, right? So on one side, we have my colleague at Stanford, actually. Many of you may have heard of her, Oriana Mastro. She's been beating the drum that Xi Jinping actually values Taiwan really highly in the hierarchy of priorities. He would be, I've heard her say this verbatim, if Xi Jinping was forced to lose his entire navy but could get Taiwan, he'd be willing to make that trade in a second. So the cost of taking Taiwan is not deterring him from coming across the strait. Then there are other people. Andrew Nathan, a longtime China scholar, made an argument also in foreign affairs that Beijing can't afford to be patient, and that in fact Xi Jinping has not switched from deterring independence to compelling unification. And so there's an open question about this as well. And what that question comes down to is really what's in this guy's head. We don't know, right? How important is Taiwan to Xi personally? We don't know. Does he wake up in the morning and the first thing that's in his head is Taiwan, right? When he goes to bed at night, the last thing he thinks of before he closes his eyes, Taiwan, I gotta get it. Has he set an internal deadline? He's not gonna tell anybody else, maybe the 5 people in his circle, but we gotta get Taiwan before 2027. You know, don't tell anybody else, right? Is there some secret document that says that's the date? I can't disprove that, right? And so a lot of these questions come down to kind of different interpretations of what Xi Jinping says, what he does, what he spends his time on, and how you read all of the speeches about China, you know, great changes unseen in a century, or China's rise into a great power, and whether you see Taiwan inextricably linked to his legacy as the great leader of the CCP. All right, so all of that said, like I said earlier, I am an optimist by nature, and so I'm going to make the case for why peace can be preserved across the Taiwan Strait. So I'm going to give you my answer to these various debates. So first, I would note the status quo, the current Taiwan cross-strait status quo, is not an existential threat to the CCP. They do not need Taiwan to survive in power, right? And we know this. By definition, they have survived in power 73 years without controlling Taiwan, right? So the status quo is not an existential threat to the regime. And in fact, they prospered for the last 40 without controlling Taiwan, and a bit more controversially, they prospered in part because they did not control Taiwan. So in 1978, the PRC was completely cut off from the global economy, right? It was basically North Korea today. How did a country that was basically North Korea go from that to the world's manufacturing powerhouse in 40 years? Well, a lot of Taiwanese invested, kind of plugged China into the global economy, and it was Chinese capital and know-how, Taiwanese capital and know-how moved into the Chinese market that really supercharged China's economic growth. And so they have really benefited from having Taiwan outside their control. All right. Second, the status quo today, the U.S. supports officially, only if the U.S. moves towards open support of independence, or if Taiwan leaders declare independence, do I think the relationship across the strait, does Taiwan's de facto independence move towards an existential crisis for the CCP? And so let me give you an example from recent months. There's a fact sheet on the U.S. State Department website that explains the U.S. position on Taiwan. For a few days, I think this was last year actually, a few days last year, there's a line on this fact sheet that says, "We do not support Taiwan independence." That line disappeared, right? Do you remember this? It reappeared a couple days later, and so there was some battle in the State Department about whether that should or should not be there. I think that's pretty important to have there because of my argument about the status quo. If the U.S. is not reassuring Beijing that we do not support independence, we're hollowing out our own longtime policy, and we are raising the Taiwan issue closer to an existential threat to the CCP. The third reason I think the status quo is not a threat to the CCP is that Xi Jinping, and I'm going to put a positive spin on this, he's chairman of everything, so nobody else is going to out-hawk him on China. Nobody is going to force him to invade Taiwan. There's one man and one man only who's going to make that call, Xi Jinping, right? And so if he himself thinks, not today, that's good enough. There's nobody else in the military, nobody else in the party who's going to be able to say, I'm going to overthrow you because you didn't take Taiwan, right? He's in a pretty solid position now. Second, I think Taiwan leaders have embraced the status quo. And the example I like to use, and I give a version of this talk in my class as well, the example I like to use there, we talk a lot about Taiwan's authoritarian legacy and the transition gradual to democracy. And we talk a lot about Jiang Jingguo and his role in that transition. And there's a fierce debate about whether Jiang Jingguo was the first Democrat, whether he really kind of led the transition to democracy, or whether it was the Dong Wai that later became the DPP that really pushed democracy. And so for a large part of the DPP elite, the founding members of the DPP, Jiang Jingguo was the chief obstacle to democratization. And in fact, he was the last dictator of Taiwan. And in fact, he headed the security services. He threw a lot of them in jail for years, if not decades. A lot of them suffered terribly. How could you ever praise this man's legacy, right? Tsai Ing-wen last fall actually went to the Jiang Jingguo Memorial Library and Museum and gave a speech there praising this man's legacy. I thought it was a pretty bold thing for a DPP leader to do. Not only that, she got a kind of cross-party group of people on stage with her to talk about Jiang Jingguo. And so there is kind of a convergence in Taiwan, a greater shared understanding of Taiwan's history, its past, both good and bad, and about, and in particular, I found it interesting, she was reappropriating Jiang as an anti-communist freedom fighter, right? That's something all Taiwanese can get behind, whether you're blue or green, right? And so there's more room now, I think, today for a kind of consensus about preserving Taiwan's democracy and freedoms than there was during the Chen Shui-bian era, for instance. Third, I'm on the side of Beckley and Brands. On one point, I think China is nearing its peak. I think we are hitting a wall in the PRC, and I think they are much more likely to stagnate and start declining than they are to continue an inexorable rise. And so demographically, the one-child policy was in place for 40 years in China. That resulted in this population pyramid that looks pretty dire. So there's a huge cohort of people who are middle-aged. They're already starting to retire. This cultural generation cohorts. And so as a consequence, China today, their demographics look about like Japan did in the 1990s. And if you recall what happened to Japan in the 1990s, they went through a decade of zero growth, right? And actually a surprising amount of the PRC's economic expansion and prosperity can be attributed to a really favorable demographic ratio. So you have very few old people that you have to support who are not productive, you have very few young people who you have to support. So almost everybody in the population is of working age and out there contributing to the economy. And so as a consequence, you get a boom. Well, that boom, driven by demography, is coming to an end. China needs to adjust to a very different economic and demographic picture over the next few years. I'm not so sure that they can do that better than Japan did. Economically, if anything, they're doing what I would say is exactly the wrong thing. So Xi Jinping has extended party control over the most vibrant sectors of the economy. ByteDance, Alibaba, Tencent, all of these companies now have party cells in them. They're being urged to invest for political or security considerations rather than economic ones. That suggests to me that Xi distrusts the private market, and we're likely to see a worse economic performance than you otherwise would, even as China slows down. All right. The graph I like to show in my class is on this point is this one. So what I've done here is I've taken Taiwan and paired it with China at the same per capita GDP level in their respective periods of growth. And so the year for Taiwan, the starting year is 1953, and the same per capita GDP level in the PRC is 1978. And you can see when you plot them together over the first decade, maybe 2 decades, they're very close. So the PRC really kind of followed the Taiwanese trajectory in terms of growth of national income. Over the last 20 years, the PRC's numbers have fallen further and further behind the Taiwan trajectory, though. And so, if anything, I think there's a strong case to be made that the PRC is increasingly underperforming the tiger economies of East Asia. If those are the model that the PRC is following, they're falling short and falling further short each year. And so we shouldn't think of the PRC as this just magical growth machine that's going to take over the world. I think if we benchmark them against other economies that have followed a similar trajectory, they look kind of, mediocre, actually. All right, and then politically, the CCP has this overwhelming propaganda machine, right, that talks about how great Xi Jinping is, how great China is, how powerful they are, and Xi Jinping's kind of messaging about the party and its control, it's omniscient, it's all-seeing, it's all-knowing, and in particular, when I've interacted with people from the PRC and talked about political reform, they love to talk about the late Soviet Union and Gorbachev and what an idiot Gorbachev was for choosing political liberalization to address some of their concerns, some of the problems the Soviet Union was facing. So Xi Jinping is absolutely not going to be a Gorbachev. He's going to avoid the mistake that the Soviets made, right? And this is the way to preserve and to expand CCP power over the next decade. Whenever I hear this, I think of a comment that my colleague Mike McFaul at Stanford has made. Mike McFaul is a former ambassador to Russia, has written a lot on the late Soviet period. He's writing a new book called that book's already done. Hot Peace, Cold War. And one of the arguments he always makes in response to these comments is that the Chinese shouldn't be thinking about Gorbachev as the model to avoid. Instead, what they should be worried about is Brezhnev. So Brezhnev was the Soviet leader in the 70s up until the early 80s, and that was the period when the Soviet Union really hit a wall, politically and economically. And Brezhnev really didn't adapt to that well. He was very skeptical, very suspicious of economic reforms that would really juice the economy a little more. And Xi looks a lot more like a Brezhnev to me than a Gorbachev, or what he would like to be, kind of the great new kind of Mao 2.0 or whatever kind of communist leader you want to cite in the pantheon of the party's history. And then finally, the question about what happens if the PRC hits this wall. Do they, in the Beckley and Brands model, do they follow the Beckley and Brands argument that when you see a closing window of opportunity, you become increasingly desperate and risk-taking? And I actually think there's much better evidence for the opposite pattern, that when the PRC hits domestic turmoil or trouble, and I've got two examples up here, the Cultural Revolution, 10 years, 66 to 76, and then the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. During and after both of those periods, the PRC turned inward. It was actually much more conservative in its relations with the rest of the world. It was not out there taking risks and starting fights. So I actually think if the PRC hits a bunch of crises internally, the diversionary war argument that a lot of people make makes no sense here. Why would you want to pick a fight over Taiwan if you're facing a really dire banking crisis that may cripple your economy for a generation? Make peace with the outside world so you can deal with that problem. Fourth, I think the military option for Xi Jinping, despite all of the rhetoric about the PLA's new capabilities, is very unattractive. And there is, again, a massive propaganda campaign to convince the Taiwanese the PLA can do this. They are able to close off access to Taiwan. They're able to fire missiles over the island. Look at all this power we have. You should just give up, right? That's a very self-serving narrative for the CCP, and you should apply a bit of a discount factor to that. They have an incentive to exaggerate and even to bluff to make you fold, right? And in fact, the idea of a full-scale invasion should scare the living daylights out of that side as well as this side. In fact, we have from history a lot of examples of amphibious invasions. They're the hardest thing a military can be asked to do, and they're usually a mess, right? The US has a lot of experience of this from the Pacific War and following, a little bit in the Korean War. But our invasion of Japanese-held islands in the Pacific Even though we had a massive advantage in men and material, they were difficult fights, and they took a long time. They resulted in a huge number of casualties. This is not something that would be simple or easy for any military, let alone the PLA, which has no war-fighting experience over the last 40 years, right? They have never even tried to do something like this. Most of the people in the military today have never seen, have never been involved in live conflict. And so Xi Jinping, even if all of these military leaders say, yeah, boss, we got this, 大老板，我们可以，我们会，放心, right? He says, wait a minute, right? So I think Xi Jinping has good reasons to be a bit suspicious or doubt a bit the leadership of the PLA. There's been a big reform in the PLA to try to promote people who are loyal to him. Maybe not, they maybe have not gotten their promotions because they're the best at their job, but because they're politically correct or they're politically loyal to Xi Jinping. That should also make him worried a little bit, that the military's own top leadership may not be as competent as they otherwise would be after these reforms. In addition, if you're actually starting a conflict over Taiwan with the United States, and you actually kill Americans in the start of that conflict, the US is not just going to fight in the Taiwan Strait. The US, in that case, is going to take on China all over the world. And in fact, China does not have a blue water navy that can effectively protect their supply lines outside of East Asia. And so there's a huge vulnerability that China faces, which is that the vast majority of their oil imports now come through sea lanes that come up through the Straits of Malacca and up through the South China Sea. It would be fairly easy for the United States to block these imports, right? And so the PRC, at a minimum, needs to find ways to lessen this dependence before they're in any kind of position to go after Taiwan and risk a conflict with the United States over Taiwan. Related point, China's own economy still relies heavily on running a trade surplus with the rest of the world. They had an $800 billion trade surplus in 2021. About half of that was with the United States alone. If you start a hot conflict with the United States, kiss that trade surplus goodbye, right? And so they need to adjust their economy to become more autarkic or more domestic focused. Xi Jinping has not really found a way to raise domestic consumption, and they still rely heavily on exporting a lot to the rest of the world in order to keep the economy going. And so starting a conflict over Taiwan would be incredibly economically destructive for the PRC. And then finally, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on this point, but from where I sit, I think the US commitment to defend Taiwan actually looks pretty credible today. For one, the US has, US observers, a lot of us have just woken up to the fact that 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductor chips are made here on this island. Losing access to those chips would have a major impact on our own economy. The US has supply chains that are very vulnerable in a potential invasion of Taiwan. And equally important, allies and partners in the region are also facing the same threat from the PRC. There are territorial claims that are in dispute with China, between China and Japan and China and the Philippines. All of those things would be at stake in a contingency over Taiwan. And so if the US were just to walk away, the world would look very different and much worse from a US perspective the day after the PLA raises the five-star flag in Taipei. So much worse, in fact, that I think anybody who actually thinks this through carefully says, yeah, the US would probably have to intervene and would have to bring a lot to try to prevent that outcome from happening. Second, my reading of the US response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine is that it was at about the upper threshold of what was possible, or what most people thought was possible before that invasion. And so the fact that the European allies have kind of presented a united front in terms of economic sanctions on the Russians. Lots of countries of NATO are now donating material and resources to the Ukrainians for that fight. The US has appropriated over $50 billion. for that fight as well. The U.S., compared to Taiwan, Ukraine is much further down the priority list in terms of U.S. interests. The U.S. didn't have any sort of commitment to defend Ukraine on February 23rd last year. The U.S. may have had, we had the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 that took nuclear weapons out of Ukraine. Maybe after 2014, when Russia invaded eastern Ukraine and annexed Crimea, the U.S. condemned Russia and started providing support for Ukraine. But the point here is the U.S.-Ukrainian relationship is fairly new and it's fairly shallow. It hasn't had a whole lot of time to deepen. It's an order of magnitude lower than the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, all right? So the U.S. has been involved in this confrontation since 1950. Taiwan is the U.S.'s 10th largest trading partner. Taiwan is a democracy today. Most Taiwanese leaders have actually studied in the U.S., or a lot of them have, right? So there's a lot of people-to-people ties here as well. So I actually really don't like the Ukraine-Taiwan comparison very much at all. And I think if you want to make that comparison, you have to say, this is an absolute baseline for what the U.S. has done for Ukraine is an absolute baseline for what the U.S. would do for Taiwan. And it's probably much, much, much more. In addition, I think there have been significant shifts since the war in Ukraine started last year among many U.S. partners and allies. And in particular, Japan and Australia have actually been willing to say publicly they're concerned about the Taiwan Strait. They're willing to talk about that in conversations with the U.S. as a shared interest. And they're willing to talk in private on a much more detailed level about what they might be asked to do in the event of a contingency over Taiwan. This was almost unimaginable 5 years ago. The allies and partners were really, really reticent to even mention Taiwan in bilateral conversations. This is the former head of NATO. He was in Taiwan a few months ago, right? This also was almost impossible to think about 5 years ago. And then finally, in the long term, I think the responses to Putin's invasion of Ukraine actually, people have woken up to the idea that major power conflict is real in Europe. It's potentially real in Asia. It's not just some hypothetical. And so people are much more kind of pragmatically focused on how to deter and how to provide the kinds of equipment and signaling necessary to deter over the next few years. And so just one example, there's a German cabinet minister. Maybe she's taken off already, but she was here earlier this week. That's the first visit from a German cabinet minister in 26 years, right? The Germans have traditionally been the ones most deferential to Chinese objections and preferences. If they're also sending cabinet members to Taiwan, to me, that's a sign that the conversation in Europe has changed pretty dramatically, and they're willing actually to consider Taiwan on its own terms in a way they weren't 5 years ago. So thanks for listening. I hope I didn't go on too long, and I'd love to get your reactions and comments and criticisms. Bring it. Thank you.
Templeman. So we'll start today's exciting part.
Okay.
Q&A session. So I'll start to invite invited guests to raise any question if you have. Okay, Harry Hardy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. Kharis, I've heard a lot of these talks, both online and in person, and this is one of, if not the best of the kind I've ever heard. I want to really congratulate you for it. Very balanced and almost entirely persuasive. But I do want to raise a few questions about your optimism. I'm not so much speaking only for myself, but I'm sure you've been here on this trip long enough to know that there is a lot of skepticism in Taiwan, that the situation is as optimistic as you say. Part of that is highly partisan. The KMT is making that case every day, that the DPP has got us into this mess. We had this great relationship with China when we controlled the presidential office. And now the DPP has ruined it, and the United States is not going to be able to save us. But let me indicate a few questions that suggest some of the more serious concerns, and in no particular order. I think, first of all, there is this sense, and you gave a very good summary of the history here. Taiwan has always assumed, or I mean almost always, I would say always assumed, that they would have to do very little to defend themselves until the U.S. came to the rescue. And now, in part because of the war in Ukraine, it's clear that the United States expects them to pay a very high price, much higher than they had expected. It's not just holding out for a short period of time, it's holding out for longer because it'll take the United States longer to get here. And because the Ukraine example shows the U.S. expects its smaller, let's use the word protectorates, to do more for themselves. So that's number one.
Yeah.
Number two is that you say that some of our allies, both in Asia and in Europe, are basically more concerned about Taiwan than ever before. True. And they're talking about the need to protect Taiwan, help protect Taiwan. But I think there's great skepticism here as to what they would actually do if the flag goes up. Number three, and most worrying to me, is the way in which war games played in the United States are presented as showing that the United States will either lose or will pay such a high price that they wonder if the U.S. is willing to pay it. I know enough about war games to know that war games are not predictions, they are simply scenarios, but they are presented in many quarters as forecasts. And so that, I think, is raising concerns here in Taiwan. Yeah. And I think, too, the argument most basically is China is just too big, it's never going to go away, and basically this will be a long struggle, and ultimately the Chinese simply have the advantage of size and location, and the United States will get tired and lose the capability. Yeah. I'm not saying that those are all correct, but I just want to, I think that your optimism, however justified it may be, is not shared uniformly here. And I wonder how you would suggest increasing Taiwan's self-confidence that they can put up a good resistance, that the rest of the world will help, the United States will be able to effectively help Taiwan defend itself.
Okay. Yeah, great comments and great points as well. I picked up on the same thing. I've been sort of aware of it because even in the U.S. you can get I get the 世界日报. It's just down the street at a mailbox down the street. I'll get the paper and just look at it. And it's mostly so Bay Area coverage. But there are always 3 pages of news about Taiwan in the 世界日报. And so I like to go just grab that, look at the 3 pages and see what is, so 世界日报 is connected to the 联合报, the United Daily News Network, right? And so it's really interesting to see what gets reported in that and what Chinese readers, even in the US, are seeing about Taiwan. And I've been amazed and increasingly worried about the kind of vague skepticism about the United States that appears repeatedly, especially in unsigned op-eds in that paper. And so coming here then, I can actually get 联合报, I can turn on the TV, I can talk to, most alarmingly, I can talk to college students here, and many of them raise some of the same questions. So the kind of, there's a narrative that is internally contradictory in some ways, that the U.S. just wants to use Taiwan to keep China down as a pawn in a larger struggle. But then that the U.S. won't ever come to defend Taiwan, on the other hand. It's like, how would we use Taiwan to keep China down if we're not actually defending Taiwan? That's internally contradictory, but you make one argument on the top of the page and you make the other argument on the bottom of the page, and maybe there's a story in between, and a casual reader might internalize both of those arguments and be more worried or more skeptical about U.S. involvement. So yes, I have picked up on it. Students are asking it too now. I've given this talk 3 times already on this trip, and the previous 2 times at universities, and one of the first questions is, if the U.S. just cares about Taiwan because of TSMC, they want to move TSMC to the U.S., they're building a fab in Arizona. Once that fab's done, is the U.S. going to come to Taiwan's aid because they won't have an incentive anymore? And that's problematic on several levels and completely unrealistic, but that's the kind of, that's the anti-American narrative I think that's creeping in. So the first and foremost thing I will say is the US, we have a big messy political system. There are lots of voices saying lots of different things, and it can be confusing for somebody who's not in that space to know who to listen to, and it's also problematic from our side that people are voicing things publicly that do kind of reinforce these narratives unwittingly. So the example I have in my head is the former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said, you know, we can't allow TSMC to fall into the hands of the PRC, and that gets picked up here as the US is going to seize TSMC and take it abroad. So we on our side, the US, the people who are worried about the Chinese threat to Taiwan need to recognize also that there's a big messaging challenge we have in the relationship with Taiwan, and we need to do a better job of making the case that the US has many reasons, many of them going back to 1950, to care deeply about Taiwan, be committed to its prosperity and its safety and its continued liberal democracy. And so, yeah, when I go back, I'm going to try to make this case more strongly to the people in these circles as well. I think that's first and foremost. Second, we've been in a period where the kind of people-to-people ties, like what we're doing today, I couldn't do this for the last 3 years, right? We've been able to do Zoom calls, but there's no excuse for actually kind of connecting in person and being able to have these events. And so I think we got to make up for lost time. We've got to increase the kind of people ties that we had before COVID, and I think that can help quite a bit in countering this narrative as well. And then I'm open to suggestions as well from this group about what else we might be able to do to push back against that. I'd be very curious about your suggestions. Okay, so thank you. Yes, Shirley.
Shirley?
I hate to take the opportunity to go second, but I can't resist. It was such a good presentation, Kharis, and really benefited from a comprehensive perspective, especially because I think so many speakers come to have a U.S. perspective, European or government perspective, and I think you have the domestic perspective as you've been a long-term, somebody who cares about Taiwan and Taiwanese. So with that understanding of both domestic pressure on both sides, can you, you just mentioned what O'Brien says. O'Brien made the head news today because he says everyone should have an AK-47. Yeah. So that's not really great that we have these these gap in understanding and communications, and the press doesn't help. So can I ask you, you didn't mention trade and investment too much. And as you know, a lot of these people, German ministers visiting us isn't great for us. Pelosi visiting us is dividing sometimes rather than uniting, depending on the age group. So my question is, what do you think the U.S. between Congress and executive branch really should be doing to upgrade relations that is beneficial to Taiwan, and what should Taiwanese do to help further that, whether it's conscription, defense, trade and investment, more pork, organs, or what is it that you think really we should focus on before the next electoral change on both sides? And I think something, because you did so much conceptual framework, something specific for us to take home and think about, so we work on improving Taiwan's status in the world without falling into whether U.S. is going to bomb TSMC or not. Thank you.
Wow, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here. I've been increasingly frustrated with some of these more extreme comments about how Taiwanese should all go to the gun range and you should be like the Ukrainians and eat bark off trees and pop out of foxholes and throw Molotov cocktails into tanks from your car and stuff. Number one, we can't let it get to that point, right? And I think China can still be deterred, and part of deterrence is actual social resilience. And the resilience is not people with AK-47s. It's a clear kind of cross-party consensus about what Taiwan is, what its future is, about the right of opposition parties to compete, to speak, and about how to mobilize a whole of society defense against the PRC. Let's be frank, there is there is a prolonged effort by the CCP to try to feed this narrative that Taiwan is small, the CCP is huge, Taiwan needs to cut a deal with the PRC, or else you will all have to have AK-47s and fight. And some of the rhetoric coming out of the US unwittingly feeds right into that PRC narrative. And so on our side, the US side, I think we need to recognize that we're sometimes doing the CCP's work for it in Taiwan. A really concrete thing is, I wish the US would start talking about a bilateral tax treaty with Taiwan. And this is personal because our program invites a lot of people from Taiwan to speak. We pay them an honorarium. We don't have a tax treaty with Taiwan, so we have to pay an extra 32% so that they get their $1,000 US. So that gets popped up to what, $1,400. I would like to save that extra $400, if nothing else. But a bilateral tax treaty is not, it doesn't necessarily involve all of the kind of broader trade barriers that are really just really difficult to overcome in Congress and in the U.S. Trade Representative's office right now. Talking about taxes, it's kind of boring. It's the kind of thing that there's not a clear constituency in the U.S. that would oppose a bilateral tax treaty. We have it with lots of other countries. The only challenge is actually concern about money laundering. So we don't have a bilateral tax treaty with any other country that we don't recognize. So we don't have it with the Cayman Islands, for instance, because that's a place where a lot of money gets laundered. Taiwan is not a place where a lot of money gets laundered. Maybe a little bit, but not a lot, right? And so I think if all these people in Congress are talking about how important Taiwan is to us, how great it is, all the people in the administration talking about how we need to support Taiwan, why not do this one thing? Politically, it's not that difficult. So yeah, start there. I wish we could get a larger free trade agreement. I don't think with this administration that's on the table, maybe in a second term of the Biden administration or if there's a Republican administration, but it pains me to say that because I know full well how much political capital Tsai Ing-wen put into lifting the ban on US pork-fed ractopamine, and just how hard she had to work to do that, and then to defeat the referendum to overturn it. I mean, this is a huge issue here. She did all of this to prepare the groundwork, and the US was like, okay. And then we haven't actually moved. We haven't delivered on our side of the deal. And so that's on us, that's our problem. And so, the kind of Robert O'Brien type folks who are talking about how the Taiwanese need to do more. Well, politically they're doing some things. We need to get beyond the kind of narrow military space and broaden our engagement to a lot of other domains. I think that is the way to sustain the relationship. And that has as much signaling value to Beijing, honestly.
Stefan, do you have a question?
I hope we'll still have enough time. Just a quick question. Very enlightening speech. Thanks a lot, Kharis. You made a great comment in which I agree. Xi Jinping, at the end of the day, with this structure of the Chinese or CCP's power, it's all boiled down to one thing, which is what he really thinks. We all want China to leave us alone, that's for sure. But what really what does he have in mind? That's a critical question to ask. Now, China is striving to survive, but along the way in this process of what is called the Grand Rejuvenization Plan or program. Now, is taking Taiwan become part of China, an integral part of its Grand Rejuvenization program? Or is rejuvenization in China becomes a great country, had its own course and destination, and taking Taiwan to become an integral part of China as consequential? That is something that we really need to psychoanalyze what Xi Jinping has in mind in that point, as opposed to the propaganda where the folks around him have that in mind. And there are lots of assessments, lots of wishful thinkings, but objectively, truth being told is that we don't really know. But I wonder what your thought on this. Thank you.
Great, yeah, thanks for the opportunity to comment on that. So I have my own take on Xi Jinping. I don't think he is Vladimir Putin 2.0. I think they're very, very different leaders. I'm a comparative political scientist by training, so we study domestic institutions, and there's a growing literature on institutions within autocracies and how autocracies themselves, it's not just this one category. There's a lot of variation within autocracies. Russia is basically a personalist regime. Putin runs that place. He got into power almost by accident because Yeltsin handpicked him. He has a background in the security services, so the point I'm trying to make here is he didn't come up through a system that was a ruling party. He had a lot of incentive to kind of hide his true intentions, to play, he's very manipulative in international relations as well. He often keeps people waiting for 3 hours before he shows up to a meeting with them. There's all kinds of psychological gamemanship that comes out of Putin. Xi Jinping is from an authoritarian regime that is close to the opposite end of the spectrum. The CCP is the world's largest bureaucracy, right? It's huge. It has 90 million members. In order to communicate with those members, you write everything down, you repeat it 30 times, people have to get the message, and it's a huge organization. How do you get to the top of a giant bureaucracy? Well, he's a party man. He kind of, he reads the way the wind is blowing. He has to be very risk averse to get up. He has to be very conservative in order to get to the top of that organization. And so, whereas Putin is kind of a gambler, a risk taker, likes to try unconventional methods to try to get an advantage, I see Xi Jinping as coming up through an organization where none of those methods would have put him at the top. What would have put him at the top was very carefully, kind of slowly building coalitions, impressing the right people, and preserving the system more or less as it is, as you move up, all right? There's a parallel argument you can make about imperial China and mandarins who moved up in the system were very conservative, didn't want to overthrow the system, right? So first off, Xi Jinping, if you have to pick risk averse or risk tolerant, I think he's risk averse. That's a good thing. And second, the open question I have is whether he's getting good information about U.S. intentions and credibility, U.S. Capabilities or will. And in Taiwan, trends in Taiwan, is the KMT completely down and out? And I was really worried during the zero COVID period in China because there was very little people-to-people exchange. And part of the apparent explanation for Putin's misunderstanding of Ukraine and the global response was that he was in isolation, right? We've all seen the picture of him at a table with two dudes at the other end of a 25-foot table, right? Total isolation. And so what I worry about is that Xi Jinping is in a similar kind of bubble of isolation. And so I'm going to say something fairly controversial here. I think it's actually a good thing that the KMT is going across the strait and talking to people about what's going on in Taiwan, because they can actually deliver a message that Beijing will hear. Beijing isn't going to talk to the DPP. They're not going to talk to other Taidu folks. But the KMT is in a position to say, basically, number one, would you help us out? Would you go quiet for the next few months? Would it help if you didn't send so many planes into our ADIZ? We'd like to win the next election, and you're not really helping right now. But the most recent delegation to go to Beijing met with Wang Huning, who is apparently the right-hand man now in charge of designing the new Taiwan policy. And Wang apparently was well prepared for that meeting, asked good questions, took lots of notes, and that tells me there's an information stream going to Xi Jinping that more closely reflects reality in Taiwan. And so, to me, the scariest thing that could happen is Xi Jinping has bad information about Taiwan, is overconfident, and launches a war through miscalculation, right? As long as he has good information about this place, about the US, and about how the rest of the world might react, then I think we're in a better place. And then I think he is a risk-tolerant leader, and he's not likely to just roll the dice on a rash rashly starting a world conflict.
Okay, because of the time limit,
Yes.
we'll open to 2 extra questions from the audience. So who has the question? Okay. Yeah, this person.
Great talk. And I want to be sensitive to the fact that you've been standing up there talking to us for a long time. So thank you for that. It was really informative. I really enjoyed your last talk about domestic issues in Taiwan as well. Went to that. I guess to keep it relatively brief, I went to Professor Diamond's talk. I try to read, like many of us in the room, try to read up on these issues. Yeah. There's a part of this where it feels like I would like the status quo to stay because we have family here, my kids are here, I don't want fighting and shooting to happen, right? Like it's,
right.
A lot of us have economic interests we're trying to preserve. The status quo, to me, feels a little bit like a tactic instead of a strategy, in the sense that, like, if we don't try to provoke conflict, if we don't openly promote independence, like say from the US side, points that you've made today, those feel like tactics. And my question is, like, to what end, I guess? And I don't have a personal point of view that I'm trying to push. I'm honestly trying to ask for academics, for people who understand these issues better than I do, of, is status quo the, under this kind of way of thinking, the ultimate long-term goal, or do these actions lead to something, a kind of a goal that feels more strategic, like either it's independence or it's the downfall of the CCP, or some sort of grander vision of where it all goes? Or is status quo the goal in and of itself, as it were? I think that's my question. Thank you.
Right. Is it a strategy or a tactic? I don't think many Taiwanese, if they had a choice to be independent as a free and independent, sovereign, recognized state, if it didn't cause a war with China, I think most Taiwanese would take that. Right? We have public opinion data on this. We've asked a conditional version of this question. If China didn't attack you, would you support independence? And the majority say yes, right? So the status quo in itself is not that desirable. It is a tactic. It's a way to get de facto independence without having China attack. I think the ultimate long-term goal here should be to get to the point where Taiwan can freely choose independence or unification. And I wouldn't rule out unification, because pragmatically speaking, what has to change is the PRC itself. There has to be political change there. And the other question that we ask in these surveys very regularly is, if the PRC looks a lot like Taiwan, if it is a democracy, if its level of development, the living standards in the PRC are equal to Taiwan's, would you support eventual unification? And actually close to a majority of people say yes on that. So there's, conditionally speaking, nobody wants the status quo, but it's better than war or unification under one country, two systems. And so ultimately, and back to the presentation I gave, one of the reasons as an American I think Taiwan is really important is because it is a refuge for people from China thinking about, who are liberal Democrats who want to see China evolve in that direction and just don't have any space to kind of preserve that idea, that dream, right? And so there's space for Taiwan to make common cause with other Chinese speakers around the world to promote a liberal democratic ideal. And related to that, it helps that Taiwan is a pretty robust liberal democracy today. You don't give yourselves enough credit for how good Taiwan's democracy is. And in most of the democratic indices around the world, so Varieties of Democracy Project, Bertelsmann Transformation Index, The Economist has a democracy index, and Freedom House from National Endowment for Democracy all rate Taiwan close to or equal with Germany. Right? Taiwan's democracy today is actually surprisingly high quality. That's probably not the impression you have, because on TV every night there's legislators throwing pig guts at each other, right? There's people yelling at each other on debate shows. But they are yelling at each other. They're able to yell at each other. They're able to have a green debater and a blue debater, and then there's somebody who's Zhongli in the middle, right? And That to me is actually an encouraging sign. It's great that there's all of this yelling and talking about and passionate debate over what Taiwan's politics and its policy and its future should be. So speaking as someone who studies democracy, I think a key part of this is making sure that Taiwan's own democratic system survives and prospers, and so Taiwan's continued success as a liberal democracy is an important part of preserving its future options. And ultimately, people from the mainland who come here are impressed in some ways about certainly about Taiwan's freedom of speech, academic freedom, and just the general kind of openness here that you don't have in Beijing or now tragically in Hong Kong, right? So that's how I'd answer that question.
Yeah, so the last question, okay, so we thank Stephen Tong. Yeah. So last question goes to Charlie Slin, and introduce yourself a little bit before you.
I was a student at Princeton previously. I had a question on your point about basically that the military option is not an attractive one for China. I'm probably in the camp of the casual reader that Harry Harding mentioned. I read about the war games and how in all the war games that happened, the U.S. lost. The U.S. came up on the losing side a lot, which kind of concerned me. I don't understand the implications of that, so maybe you can speak to that aspect. And then also, I've heard about how maybe China would implement like a blockade of the Taiwan. And what do you think the U.S. response would be in that instance? Would they proactively try to break that blockade, or what do you think that response would be? So those would be my questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. So first on the war games. They're not predictions, as Harry said. They're models, and what you learn from them depends on how you set up the game. And so you assume certain capabilities of the PRC, you assume certain capabilities of the U.S. side, and then you assume certain capabilities of Taiwan. And sometimes, not always, they include partners and allies in this too. They often, though, don't consider the broader political context, which is for China to win one of these war games, their best move typically is to engage in a first strike, and a massive first strike, and one that takes out US assets and Taiwanese assets almost all at once. Some of those US assets are in Japan, some of them are in Guam, some of them might be in the Philippines. And so for the PRC to choose the military option and decide we're going all in, it's all or nothing, they would basically be choosing a world war, right? You're not only attacking the United States, you're attacking Japan. Almost certainly Japanese civilians will die in that first strike. Almost certainly, if you go after the Philippines, Filipinos will die. The US is a NATO member. If you are striking Guam, Guam is a US territory. US could potentially invoke Article 5 from NATO because we are attacked, right? So suddenly you're bringing in NATO too. The political calculation that leads you to take that action is, I have trouble seeing under what conditions Xi Jinping would say, that's a good deal, I want to go for that. Because you might actually be able to get Taiwan initially then, but you are also in a world war with the United States, the rest of NATO, Japan, probably Australia, maybe even Korea is pulled into this. There's over 20,000 US troops in Korea. They would be very important in this fight. Do you strike them first? You've just hit South Korea too, so they're in the war on the other side. A lot of these games are set up without that broader political context in the background. And they're just designed to see if that political decision has already been made, then how would they do it? Right? And we play it out for a month, and in some cases, yeah, they've got Taiwan. In other cases, the US has kind of pushed them back. But the larger concern about escalation is abstracted out of these games a fair amount. There's also an implication of this that has to do with the nuclear umbrella. I mean, you're launching a first strike against a nuclear power, the US, right? Is that a wise thing to do? And you know, China also has a nuclear deterrent. They're expanding that nuclear deterrent. Maybe that leads to greater instability, but the writing on nuclear powers facing off against one another is that there's a kind of stability-instability paradox. When nuclear powers face off against one another, that relationship is really stable because both sides are terrified of escalation. So they find ways to back down on both sides. So I'm actually very skeptical that China would launch a first strike attack against the United States, the world's foremost nuclear power. The blockade question is much more interesting in my perspective, because there it's hard for the US to respond. We might be able to initially, but then there's a much more interesting question about who bears the burden of escalation, and that's the critical part here. If it's a blockade that stops all traffic into or out of Taiwan, there's a pretty easy solution for the US, which is you just put a US flag on a ship that's carrying critical supplies in and say, dare China to shoot at it. Right? They do, they've just hit a US, you know, that's a US flagged ship, you've just declared war on the United States. What gets more complicated, and this is probably where we should be spending more time worrying, is if there's something called a cordon sanitaire. So rather than a blockade, it's simply, we're going to board and inspect ships coming in because we suspect they have weapons on them. Taiwan is part of China. These are our territorial waters. We have every right in our own territorial waters to search stuff coming in that we think threatens our national security. Then they stop a civilian ship doing that. They board it. They, you know, seize the cargo. But they haven't actually killed anyone. They haven't sunk a ship. That's not an act of war, potentially. And so they're going to be trying to skirt that line just below what would trigger you know, international condemnation and a really robust US response. And that, I think, is where the game really needs to be played.
Okay, yeah, so that's of course at the end of our today's talk and Q&A session. And now I'm going to, welcome the Vice President of Stanford Club of Taiwan, and he's going to bring some gifts to the, and
he has a gift. I have a gift too, so let me
Vice President of the Stanford Club of Taiwan is Singer Huang.
Actually, this is prepared only with Julie.
Oh,
okay.
Thank you. The last time I saw you was almost 3 years ago. I hope to see you more.
Yes.
Also have
Every
one
time is so
Princeton.
impressed. So impressed.
So let me
Yeah,
hold
but
this.
this one is much better.
Thank
Okay,
you.
I'll
Thank you.
present mine.
Okay, please.
This is from our school template. Yeah, that's a.
It's upside down?
Yeah,
Is it?
no, you
No, it
can.
actually can be.
Oh, I see. You fold it. Got it. Okay.
Either way. Yeah, thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. And then,
So
thank
feel,
you
feel
very much.
free, feel free to hand out and talk to the
Absolutely.
speaker. Or,
So I
yeah.
did want to present just a little something from Stanford. This is from the Santa Cruz Mountains, the Fogarty Vineyard. They have a special line of Stanford branded wines up there. And so this is the last bottle that in my collection. So I'd like to present the Stanford Alumni Club here.
So this is going to be the lucky draw of our annual party. So whoever, you better be there. And you better be